Welcome to the British School at Rome. My name is Raphaël Morin. I'm the head of research collections here at the BSR. I am particularly happy today to welcome two hosts, Natasha Constantinidou and Han Lammers. I was very pleased to invite them. I took advantage of the fact that they were planning to be in the country at the same moment. So I said, oh, come to Rome and give us a paper. And what I'm very happy is that they have decided to present basically their current research project. Natasha and Han are two of the co-conveners of the European-funded project, Greek Heritage in European Culture and Identity. Natasha is currently associate professor at the University of Cyprus. In the past, she was member of the USTC project at St. Andrews. She is working on early modern intellectual history and history of the book. She has co-edited a number of books, one of them with Han Lammers on Receptions of Hellenism in early modern Europe, 15th to 17th century with Brill. She also co-edited a book with Brill a bit more than 10 years ago on documenting the early modern book world, inventories and catalogs in manuscripts and print. And she also published Responses to Religious Division, 1580-1620, Public and Private, Divine and Temporal. So she has currently a book project focusing on the printing of Greek books in 16th century Paris, but she can speak a bit about Greek books in 16th century Lyon too. And I was pleased to invite her last year to speak about that. Han Lammers is a full professor and head of subject of classics at the University of Oslo. He studied classics at the University of Leiden, and he got his PhD there in 2013. And he also studied art history at the University of Leuven. He is specializing in cultural history of ancient Greek and Latin in early modern and modern Europe. He is particularly interested in the ways these languages were used and given meaning after antiquity. His most recent publications are a critical and annotated edition of the Latin poems by Manilius, Cabacius, Rallus of Sparta, a Rome-based Renaissance poet from Greece, published this year by Brill. He also co-edited, you've seen the book with Natasha, and he also published in 2015, Greece Reinvented, Transformation of Byzantine Hellenism in Renaissance Italy. He's also interested in the use of Latin in fascist Italy and the history of scholarship. So those who know me know now why I absolutely wanted to invite them. So welcome to Natasha and Han, and I will speak today about Greek heritage in European culture, books, language, and identity.
Good evening. Thank you, Raphael, for this very kind introduction and also a very kind invitation. We're very happy to be here as part of our, let's say, tour of Italy or something like that. So, we are all Greeks. This slogan, which you may have seen many times, reflects a strong and widely shared sense of Greek heritage in modern European identity. A similar sentiment is echoed in the phrase, Europe without Greece would be like a child without a birth certificate, that Valéry Giscard d'Estaing uttered on the eve of Greece's entry into the EU monetary union. But where does this notion come from? What is its history? The concept is often traced to Romantic Philhellenism, and the first phrase itself indeed originates from the Romantic poet Percy Shelley. Another issue is, who is we? Does we refer to Europeans collectively, or are there different we's at play? For example, Europeans may feel connected through classicizing architecture, which is found wherever one travels. But in addition to being seen as Europe's shared history, this architecture can also be regarded as indicative of national and even local cultures. Here, just 3 examples from the 3 countries represented in the project. In the project we are introducing today, we delve beyond accepting the notion of Europe's Greek past as a modern or 19th century construction. Instead, we aim to trace its history further back to a watershed moment for the reception of Greek heritage in Europe. The project Greek Heritage in European Culture and Identity, in short, GrECI, explores a key phase in the formation of this European identity, the reception and appropriation of ancient Greek culture in early modern Europe between the 15th and the 17th century. In our view, the interpretation of Greek heritage has played a crucial role in both unifying and highlighting differences among Europeans. To study the different facets of this reception, the project brings together an interdisciplinary and international framework within a consortium of 3 partners from Cyprus, Norway, and France. In this presentation, we aim to introduce the GrECI project and illustrate 2 of its main focal areas, book history and language studies, by briefly explaining the research we ourselves are conducting in this context. Our presentation has 2 main parts. First, we will outline the main ideas behind GrECI, including the consortium's aims and scope within the wider twinning program of the European Commission, as well as highlight some of the activities undertaken so far. In the second part, we will illustrate our research by discussing our specific interests and ongoing investigations as they are developing within the project, while we conclude with some observations arising from our outreach meetings. Just a few quick words on what the Twinning Funding Scheme is. It is an EU Horizon program aiming to enhance potential of networking for excellence through knowledge transfer and exchange of best practices. It does so by linking one institution from the so-called widening countries, namely countries which entered the EU at a later stage and are seen as less research intensive, with at least 2 research institutions from 2 different member states or associated countries. In this case, the University of Cyprus joined forces with the University of Oslo and the University of Franche-Comté. A twinning project typically involves both researchers and members of the research management and staff. In what follows, we will mainly address research-related activities, but we're happy to discuss a research management component during the discussion afterwards.
So what is the GrECI project about, and how did we arrive at creating it with this particular constellation of partners and disciplines? From a historical point of view, the reception and appropriation of different forms of Hellenism in the European past has been a central process in Europe's cultural history, with complex implications for the formation of European identities. From the moment Greek language and literature returned to the Latin-dominated West in the early Renaissance, young people learned Greek and studied Greek texts, either in the original or in translation, in the context of humanism, the educational trend which became popular among the social and political elites of the Italian city-states. With the spread of humanism beyond the Alps in the 16th century, it became a staple among the educated elites of the period throughout the continent, recognizing it as part of their common or shared European past. The crucial point here is the shared curriculum. Pupils whose families could afford it were all exposed to the same texts. Apart from the standard Latin curriculum, they studied texts and authors such as Aristotle, Isocrates, Lucian, St. Basil, Isocrates, Xenophon, Plutarch, Aristophanes, Demosthenes, and Homer. There emerged a complex interplay between European and local perspectives in due course. While the shared engagement with ancient Greek heritage may have fueled the notion of a coherent European cultural space, it was also deeply intertwined with local and national debates of a religious and cultural nature. We will return to this when we discuss our own research lines. For example, Greek studies gained prominence in the context of religious reform and confessional struggle. Figures like Lorenzo Valla, Erasmus of Rotterdam, Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, Martin Luther, and Philip Melanchthon emphasized the importance of Greek as means to understand scripture and the Greco-Roman context of early Christianity, of the early church. Both the Catholic Church, which stressed continuity of tradition, and the reformers who sought to return to early Christianity, claimed connections to the early Christian past. Additionally, Greek heritage was either assimilated into emerging national identities or contested as foreign, exotic, irrelevant. Scholars across Europe claimed linguistic or ethnic ties to ancient Greece to assert cultural superiority over neighboring nations. And thus Greek texts, ideas, artifacts became central to significant cultural and political debates of the early modern period. At the starting point of our research, we have identified 4 areas that we found particularly important to understand how ancient Greece could become a common archive for generations of Europeans. First, the dissemination of Greek texts through the production of books. Secondly, the role of Greek language and literature in the cultural debates on the emergence and competition of national or vernacular cultures. Thirdly, the resonance of Greek learning for the religious polemics and confessional strife during the period. And finally, the direct engagement of Europeans with the physical remains of the ancient Greek past. Accordingly, these 4 subjects constitute the, let's say, thematic focal points of our project, with specific case studies highlighting the issues at hand. These case studies, as well as wider questions surrounding them, are discussed in 4 research meetings, each dedicated to one of the above topics. These meetings take place in the form of workshops or discussion days. The first one was a very successful workshop at the University of Cyprus in June last year, with the title Greek Books and Europe's Common Culture. An equally interesting workshop on material culture and digital approaches took place at the Norwegian Institute in Athens in February of this year, while we held a more closed research meeting on language and culture in June in Oslo. A 4th meeting will explore the use of Greek sources in religious polemics. It will take place at University of Franche-Comté in May 25. And then the final international conference towards the end of the project will take place in Cyprus and will bring all these themes together to help us draw out conclusions in a published volume and establish further points of research. This conference will be the kind of the crowning part of the project. Now that we have explained the general idea behind GrECI and how we have structured our research, we'd like to share a bit about the background of this twinning project, what sparked our interest in this subject and led us to gather together as a group. I'm showing you a book that Natasha and I published in November 29, Receptions of Hellenism in Early Modern Europe. This book collects papers written by scholars from various academic backgrounds, various national backgrounds, and shedding light on various aspects of the reception of Greek culture in early modern Europe. The book illustrates the concerns that originally informed this project. The publication resulted from a series of research meetings and workshops that brought together scholars working on early modern Hellenism from very different perspectives. Despite similar interests, we often worked in isolation due to disciplinary boundaries, academic cultures, language barriers sometimes. And you could say that the field of early modern Hellenism is paradoxically international, yet often anchored in national contexts of like education, literature, and history. But to truly grasp the Europe-wide impact of Greek studies, we needed a more interconnected approach that accounts for regional and national variations in how Greek heritage was adopted and places them within a wider European framework. For this reason, we sought to connect with colleagues as a way of working together to deepen our understanding of the complex Europe-wide phenomenon of early modern Hellenism. And our search led us to Marie Barral-Baron, who shares our research interests as reflected in her edition of prefaces published by 2 important French scholars and editors of Greek texts, Adrien Turneb and Guillaume Morel. She is our partner from the University of Franche-Comté in Besançon. By bringing together scholars with different academic and national backgrounds in this training project, we hope to create a more concerted approach to the study of early modern Hellenism.
In the second part of our presentation, we will illustrate how we approach the overarching questions addressed by the GrECI consortium from our own scholarly perspectives within the project, book history and language studies. So now I will first discuss my work with the project, focusing on the history of Greek books, their production, dissemination, and their impact on European identities. Next, Han will present his research on the use of ancient Greek language in the construction of early modern language communities across Europe. And on Greek books and Europe's common culture. In the dedicatory epistle to the reader of Xenophon's Apomnemonevmata of 1529, Rudgerus Rescius, professor and printer of Greek in Louvain at the Trilingual College, justified his printing enterprise as a way of providing texts for his own students and for all who wished to study. The epistle also claimed that he had been teaching Greek, quote, not as he wished, but as he could, unquote, since there had always been a want of books from which to read. This example illustrates the desire and requirement to learn Greek and the consequent need for books in that language in the early part of the 16th century. Thus, to understand how early modern Europeans engaged with ancient Greek language and culture, how Greek textual heritage was disseminated and received by Western learners is pivotal. The team at the University of Cyprus has been approaching this topic through the field of book history as a way of assessing the dissemination of Greek texts through the production of books. It has become a commonplace to refer to the wide availability of Greek texts during the 16th century with printers and publishers such as Aldo Manuzio in Venice, the Giunti in Florence and Venice, Froben in Basel, or the Etiennes in Paris and Geneva, producing the so-called classics in the original language in printed form for the very first time. This subject certainly merits further investigation. Given the significance that the diffusion of Greek learning had in all aspects of early modern thought, it is probably surprising that scholarship has still not fully charted all the editions of Greek texts printed in Western Europe since their first appearance in 1476. A current rough estimate of the number of these editions may appear impressive, as it were, although we are still not able to provide final assessments. With some moderate estimates, we currently think that there may have been more than 1,300 editions of Greek books in France by the end of the 16th century, about 1,200 for the Holy Roman Empire, about 1,200 for the Italian peninsula, and this is a recent number. It's an increase of about 300 editions that were based on previous estimates, 600 for the Swiss Confederation, and roughly the same for the Netherlands, although politically the North and the South separated in the third quarter of the 16th century. This is a considerable number of editions. It is a body of works, moreover, that due to disciplinary boundaries that Han referred to earlier, has not been systematically studied and analyzed. Within the GrECI project, we are in the process of charting and studying a small part of them, currently focusing on those pertaining to the Italian peninsula and the Holy Roman Empire. The background to these publications is to be found in the spread of Greek learning in the 16th century. The learning of Greek, the means to accessing classical and patristic texts, as well as many parts of the scripture, required a number of books to be published during the first century of print, namely until 1600. Apart from the main texts themselves, however, this activity required and generated a number of books that would help with language learning, such as primers or alphabets, grammar books, and dictionaries. Furthermore, in the course of the 16th century, the activity of scholars also produced a number of other books in Greek, commentaries, studies, and analysis, as well as imitative and laudatory poetry. The printed Greek classical text only gradually increased its popularity in the course of the century in areas outside Italy and north of the Alps. The beginnings of Greek printing in geographical areas beyond the Alps arose in a background of claims similar to rescues, with scholars complaining about the dearth of teaching materials. In some ways, the story of these beginnings throughout Western Europe has been told. After the appearance of the first Greek books in the Italian peninsula, a grammar by Constantine Lascaris in 1476, Greek printing spread elsewhere as well, albeit with some delay. In the Holy Roman Empire, the first grammar was issued in 1501 in Erfurt. In Paris, Gilles de Gourmont printed her Celeras Erotemata in 1507, while the next decade, Greek grammar books appeared in Spain, in Alcalá de Henares, and in Basel. A Greek alphabetum contained a Latin grammar printed by Adam Petri in 1516. If this is a known story, however, what is less known is how the story progressed. What books were published, who published them, and why. The story of the books, in other words, is also the story of the institutions, people, and the ideas and the cultural and intellectual trends behind these books. Thus, apart from the interest in returning to the classical sources, the impetus for learning Greek was also driven often by people who were interested in reforming the church, through returning to the text of the Bible, and through returning to the principles of early Christianity, reclaiming the early Christian past for themselves. A growing interest in the Greek Testament and the Septuagint, therefore, created the drive for the establishment of trilingual colleges throughout Europe, aiming at teaching the three sacred languages together, such as the Collegium Trilingue in Louvain, the Collège de France in Paris, the College of Alcalá in Spain, Calvin's Academy in Geneva, and others. These colleges, in turn, provided a further impetus for the publication of Greek books. Many of the Greek printing centers were also college towns, with student populations in need of textbooks, and professors needing to increase their publication profile, a bit like today, right? And what did they publish? This is often a question when I present parts of my work. They published everything, from editions in folio, for instance, used as reference works, including dictionaries, sometimes missals, as well as complete works of a classical author or a church father. These were expensive and also often luxurious editions. They have survived well in many copies and may be the most recognizable to a wider audience. The most popular Greek editions, however, were the editions in quarto format, let's say an academic textbook at the moment. These were the textbooks for specific subjects such as logic or rhetoric or even medicine or philological humanistic editions. We call humanistic editions the ones that normally include a great deal of paratextual material, such as a dedication to a potential patron, a preface with some explanation of the main text, epigrams from other scholars in honor of the author or editor, commentaries, notes, sometimes index. These texts could be the products of lectures or research as we understand it today, and their audiences were readers of a higher level, possibly other scholars or advanced students. The complexity as well as the status that such editions commanded are often evident from their verbose title pages. And something has gone slightly wrong with the one on the left, I think. All this paratextual material, however, contains a treasure trove of information that can place the book as a cultural product within specific intellectual networks. Who contributed to the book? Who paid for it? Who it was written for? Where did it travel to? To whom it was taught? Take this book that I'm showing you, for example, which is a grammar The author, as you can see, is Nikolaos Klenardis. He originated from the Low Countries, but this, however, is an edition from Lyon. And so then we have a book that traveled from the Low Countries to Paris, and then from Paris to Lyon. It was then printed in Lyon. And not only was printed in Lyon, but it was printed in Lyon with an additional material by a local professor of Greek called Antasinian. So it has added extra material to this book. And then we also have an earlier edition of the same book printed in Paris with additional material from the local professor of Greek, René Guillaume. So we have different appropriations of the same text that originated from the Low Countries in two different places in France, changing and expanding the edition in there. And then again, with the same comments incorporated in the text, again in Paris. Finally, the most numerous editions in Greek were the ones in the octavo format. Here, the size excluded luxury. Most of the editions in this format were student books or manuals, which could be carried about in the form of a book. Their most distinctive feature was that their contents were usually printed exclusively in Greek, with the exception, evidently, of our alphabets and grammars, which were often bilingual. They often included single texts of an author, which were frequently used in Greek instruction, such as individual dialogues by Lucian or specific orations by Isocrates and other orators, individual books, namely chapters from the Homeric texts, parts of the Bible, etc. Understanding what was printed and how often, as well as in which format, is therefore paramount in order to begin assessing the cultural and intellectual significance of these editions and their spread. Indeed, what may or may not come as a surprise is that in most printing domains, over 1/3 of the Greek production, sometimes up to half of their Greek production, was connected to teaching and teaching materials, which is slightly surprising when we consider that during the Renaissance, or the big Renaissance claim is return to the sources. Well, if the Greek editions, or more than half of the Greek editions, are teaching materials, then who is returning to the sources? They're still trying to learn Greek. So by tracing these, one can come to a number of conclusions regarding the spread of this learning, the instigators, the reasons behind it, and its uses. And which authors did they read in the original? Perhaps not many people in the audience would be surprised to see Aristotle and Homer in the top 3. But what about Lucian and Demosthenes? Furthermore, that you will see that in the top 10, there are 2 Christian fathers, Johannes Chrysostom and Basil of Caesarea. If we were only to include classical authors, we would then be able to include Aristophanes or Xenophon. But then we can also talk about regional differentiations. Plato and Plutarch, for example, were more popular in France. And here you see the total European output, for example, for Homer and Plato, and then you see so let's say the priority of top 10 authors in the case of Europe and in the case of France. So we see that the different authors are popular in different areas. And these are 2 editions from the French context, and then evidence of the primacy, let's say, or the preference of Plutarch again in France. The historical context, therefore, in the intellectual and educational trends and the people involved in the publications are the keys to understanding this complex picture, which has not been fully charted yet. A study of Greek editions will therefore contribute to our understanding of this intellectual background within which they were produced. But the other way around is also true. We can understand the ebb and flow of these editions only by placing them into their historical context. Thus, a chart of the production of the Greek classical books in Paris in the 16th century looks a little bit like this. And the very high peaks that you see in the 1530s are connected to the official, establishment of the royal lecturers in France. So then this is connected to more editions appearing. Then you might be able to see that there is a dip in production after 1560s, which is when the French wars of religion start, and so on. So these are connected to, the production is connected to the historical context. Questions regarding the circulation of books and the international nature of these editions were addressed in the research meeting organized in Cyprus in June 2023, and you may recognize your head librarian in this picture. And these are scheduled to be published in an edited volume by the end of next year, hopefully. In many ways, all this work is just scratching the surface, as much more work is required in order to assess the dissemination of this learning, its intellectual and cultural impacts, and the manner in which it was appropriated by Western scholars and audiences.
While the history of Greek books shows how Greek learning became part of a common European curriculum, we are also interested in how early modern people explicitly identified with ancient Greek heritage. Did early modern individuals see ancient Greece as part of their cultural heritage, and if so, how? And how do their views differ from more modern perspectives? We mentioned the slogan, "We are all Greeks," at the start of our presentation, often linked to modernity. However, early modern individuals also connected with the ancient Greeks, frequently through their languages. In early modern Europe, the study of Greek language, literature, and history was not merely a matter of examining a remote, unfamiliar culture. While the Greek language and its original speakers were sometimes viewed as exotic and even potentially threatening, early modern Europeans often also had a deep sense of connection to this cultural heritage. They saw it as a shared archive of wisdom and felt a sense of obligation to study, protect, and advance it. This sense of a shared heritage was often accompanied by the idea that certain groups or nations had a privileged relationship with the ancient Greeks, historically, culturally, or even in terms of descent. However, numerous examples of this Europe-wide phenomenon in regions such as the Low Countries and Scandinavia remain underexplored. Meanwhile, the picture for well-studied areas such as Italy and France remains incomplete. The existing scholarship mainly consists of specific case studies dispersed over various publications and lacking an overarching comparative perspective. They often concentrate on a specific individual in isolation or treat a specific milieu. Within the GrECI project, several case studies are being developed, and we hope these will lead to a more comprehensive understanding of this subject. Before I discuss what has been accomplished so far and what we still aim to do, I would like to share how I became interested in this subject, as it also provides some historical background to it. My interest in the European perspective began while studying a particular group of people. One key group identifying with the ancient Greeks in early modern Europe were the Byzantines, who arrived in Italy in the 15th century. Figures like Cardinal Bessarion, Janus Laskaris, and Michael Marullis adopted Greek identities, moving away from traditional Byzantine claims to imperial Rome. Language was central to this, as Byzantium had preserved the ancient Greek literary and linguistic heritage. These scholars saw themselves as guardians of ancient Greek language and literature, sometimes considering the ancient Greeks as their family. This newfound Greekness allowed them to advocate for Greek causes. Janus Laskaris, for instance, urged Emperor Charles V to see Greece as the cultural mother of Europe and the ancient Greeks as Europe's fathers and teachers in an effort to spur action against the Ottoman Turks. And this sentiment is echoed in modern slogans like "We are all Greeks." Initial research on the Byzantine diaspora in Italy sparked my interest in how individuals without direct connections to the Greek world could still identify with this heritage. Unlike the Byzantine Greeks in Italy, whose sense of Greekness was deeply connected with their linguistic heritage and use of classical Greek, these groups across Europe did not have Greek as their native language and lived far from centers of Greek culture such as Constantinople, Athens, or Mistra in cities like Paris, Amsterdam, Copenhagen. So how did I proceed? How did I forge this connection with ancient Greece? One common approach they employed was by linking their own vernacular language to ancient Greek and highlighting historical connections between the founding figures of their countries and the ancient Greeks. Their emphasis on language is unsurprising, given that humanism was language-focused. Cultural merit was sought in the mastery of language and eloquence, and the antiquity of a language conferred dignity. Their fondness of vernacular Greekness was mainly catalyzed by an interest in promoting the vernacular languages as languages of literature and culture. In an effort to bring their language on a par with Latin and literary Italian, they attempted to connect their language to ancient Greek in various ways. Linking their languages to the ancient Greek, to the ancient language, thus allowed them to upgrade, so to speak, their own languages in terms of cultural prestige. Although this movement was particularly vibrant in Renaissance France, where it began, it was not limited to that time and place. To give just one famous example, Henri Estienne published a treatise on the similarities he saw between ancient Greek and the French of his day. For example, he would argue that the French word chef derived from the Greek kephale, and so he has many more etymologies. He would argue that various constructions and phrasings in French were similar to ancient Greek. He pointed out, for instance, that the French tense of the passé composé was similar to the Greek aorist tense. He was by no means the first to articulate such ideas, but he was the first to bring them together in a coherent exposé that comprised several language levels, from how the languages sound to how their sentences are constructed. Etienne himself made clear that he did this to purify the French language and expunge foreign words and influences, especially from Italian and Spanish. Moreover, and significantly, he did so in explicit competition with others. He responded, for instance, to the Dutch humanist Hadrianus Junius, who had made similar claims for the Dutch language. But according to Etienne, the Greek influences on Dutch were via the French and actually showed French superiority. This phenomenon was seen across Europe. For example, Ascanio Persio wrote a treatise similar to Etienne's on Greek and Italian, while Otto Reitz defended Hadrianus Junius' case for Dutch in a text titled The Greek-Speaking Dutchman. Similar arguments emerged in Spain, Denmark, and other parts of Europe. Writers competed to show whose language was closest to ancient Greek and therefore the most Greek. This rivalry among various European groups persisted throughout much of the 16th and 17th centuries. Although no clear winner emerged, the Greeks gradually lost prominence after the first and most vocal generations of the Byzantine diaspora passed away. Meanwhile, European writers were consciously engaging in what we today would call cultural appropriation, taking the Greek classics and the ancient Greek language away from the modern Greeks and claiming them as part of their own cultural heritage. Within the context of the GrECI project, we have been conducting a series of studies to explore the strategies used and the contexts in which they were effective, in addition to the case studies I've already completed on the Italian, French, and Danish contexts. We are, however, not only interested in accumulating case studies of this phenomenon, we also want to try to chart and understand evolutions, continuities, and discontinuities between periods and areas. Did, for example, French scholars use different strategies of identification than, for example, the Dutch or the Danish ones? Is European Greekness coherent? And do we find the same arguments and discursive strategies across different languages and cultural communities? Or is it rather fragmented, ad hoc, inconsistent? What were the counter proposals and the criticisms of vernacular Greekness? The image that has so far been emerging from my investigations shows that connections with ancient Greek were established across Europe for various reasons and in different ways. While the basic strategies used to link European language communities with the ancient Greeks are often very similar, there was hardly a coherent discourse on the Greek nature of Europe or a broad consensus about the Greekness of individual language communities. The narratives varied significantly, even within a single language community. Consider the French context. For example, Joachim Périllon argued that Greek and French were similar due to the historical contacts between Greeks and Gauls. Meanwhile, Henri Estienne highlighted structural similarities between the languages without providing an explicit explanation for them. To him, the mere existence of these similarities demonstrated the superiority of French compared to other languages. Léon Tripot suggested that the similarity was because the French people descended from the ancient Greeks. Additionally, some contended, by contrast, that ancient Greek civilization, including its language, had roots in their native culture, with French, Danish, and Dutch claims. And of course, there were critics of this trend of Greekness, critics who argued for Latin, Germanic, Gallic alternatives, to name just three. In broadening the geographical scope of inquiry, we have also expanded the chronological boundaries of current scholarship. Rather than concentrating solely on the 16th century, we have been including examples from the 17th, 18th, and even early 19th century. Though often associated with the 16th century, the phenomenon clearly extends beyond this period. For instance, tomorrow, or rather on Friday, I will present findings at a conference in Naples from an unstudied manuscript with French-Greek etymologies from around 1700. The author traced over 1,000 French words to ancient Greek roots, as he calls them. And he explicitly situates his own work within a 16th century tradition, including Guillaume Budet, Henri Estienne, Léon Tripot, and others. But at the same time, he uses the French-Greek parallels in an entirely new context. Specifically, in this case, I will argue that his word list is part of a Jansenist criticism of the Roman Catholic Church and French absolutism. Connecting French with Greek words allowed the author of this word list to distance his language and culture from the Roman Church, primarily represented by the Jesuits' defense of Roman Latinity. It once again highlights the important role ancient languages played in shaping cultural, ideological, and religious identities for individuals and groups in early modern Europe. The expanded chronological focus also raises the question of how early modern ideas about the ancient Greek language have persisted and potentially co-shaped modern beliefs that Greek heritage belongs somehow to Europe. My current hypothesis suggests that in the early 19th century, the main points of comparison between Europeans and Greeks changed rather than the identification itself. For example, the author of the slogan, "We are all Greeks," continued with saying that all laws, or literature, or religion, and or arts have their roots in Greece. He did not mention language, which I find significant against the background of then more than two centuries of attempts to connect European languages with ancient Greek. By the early 19th century, national romanticism and Indo-European linguistics may have begun to overshadow early modern notions of vernacular Greekness. The shift away from language-based identifications with the ancient Greeks is, for example, evident even earlier in the work of Niels Idman, who published a book in 1774 on the relationship between the Finns and the Greeks, first in Swedish, later translated into French. Instead of focusing on language, Idman emphasized the folkloric kinship between ancient Greeks and Finns, moving toward a more culturally based and more generalized identification similar to Shelley's. In the end, I hope the story of European Greekness can be told in the form of a monograph. Given the scope of the research, it is now, well, let's say, uncertain if this will be achieved within the lifespan of GrECI. But a program like this at least allows scholars to focus on the research needed to form a comprehensive picture and engage others in the conversation. And I hope some of the case studies we have produced will already hint at the larger story to come at some point in the future.
So after we've discussed our research, and as a way of bringing this presentation to a close, we would like to now briefly mention 2 outreach meetings we had. Okay, there we go. These not only highlight the resonances of this work for the present day, but also showcase some of the additional activities stemming from the GrECI project beyond scholarly meetings and publications. In the early modern period, and later on, as we highlighted, the curriculum throughout European educational circles was similar. In contrast, today the focus is mainly on national literatures and histories. This was a concern for Henrik Brugmans, who stressed the importance of a shared cultural history in Europe, but noted that, quote, "We were taught from childhood in all countries to see the national variety rather than the common European elements." Given the emphasis on national master narratives in history education, it is crucial to explore the potential of classical tradition or a reference to a common past and literature to also serve as a catalyst for a shared culture and identity. Early modern Hellenism can serve as a template or inspiration for that. Thus, beyond the consortium's commitment to research, we have been exploring over 2 outreach meetings with a number of stakeholders the various ways in which European countries today form and convey different understandings of Greek and classical heritage. Following our concerns about the role of curricula in the shaping of identities, and particularly the teaching of classical languages, national or non-national literature and history, and as a starting point for this consideration, we created this rough overview that you can see on the slide. And this is how high school students in the countries represented in the project learn about the past generally and classical cultures in particular. The disparities are notable and telling, whether ancient languages are compulsory, for example, how many years are taught, whether non-national literature is compulsory, how many years is taught, and what kind of history is being taught. Over a 2-day summer school in Cyprus in June, and a subsequent meeting in Besançon in October, we invited educators and educational advisors from 9 different countries to expound on their national curriculum on these subjects and to discuss their role in the creation of national and European identities. In Besançon, moreover, we invited representatives of European heritage institutions, including Maison de l'Histoire Européenne in Brussels, Maison de l'Europe in Besançon, and Euroclassica, an international organization that promotes the study of classical languages. And this is a publication of Euroclassica, which puts together different texts from different countries in ancient Greek. The presentations highlighted the variation that exists throughout Europe, while they also raised issues with regards to the history of the educational systems, many of which originated from the 19th century, to return to Hans' earlier observations. Possible new approaches to the teaching of classics, classical culture and history, and how history and identity is communicated and taught beyond schools. During the discussions of these meetings, we observed a similar tension to that seen in the early modern period. The struggle between viewing ancient Greece as a shared cultural heritage, European heritage, and recognizing its embedment in local and national cultures, as exemplified by the numerous classical themes and references surrounding us. To make ancient Greek language, literature, and history meaningful, both perspectives are valuable. One of the main challenges, therefore, is finding a balance between the local, national, and the shared. Understanding, moreover, the role of history, languages, and literature in the construction of national and supranational identities is another. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing us up to today and question that can be asked related to Europe. I can say that Henri Etienne is always very confident. I'm not surprised he doesn't prove it himself. So we have time for questions. Here in the room, you can use the microphone, and if you are online, you can put your questions on the chat. But I hope Pepe will help me.
Hi, thank you. I was struck on not the Etienne, but the other French volume you had there on the origins of French and Greek, of the use of Hebrew there too, to be saying honor your father and mother. So there's another language that's playing on the idea that some readers will have that, and that gives it a bit of a biblical injunction too. My question was for Natasha here, though, and just about those points you were making at the beginning about distribution. You were about Greek books and centers, and you were trying to argue that, trends in publication speaking to what was in demand. In what sense is that the case, and how do you play with the fact that we're also dealing with an international market in part for books, that certain centers may be producing particular kinds of books? Certainly in the early period, that's the early part of your period, that's the case. So how do you deal with things like history of publication, but also things like collection, or what else? How do you deal with that?
Thank you. That's a very good question. This is actually one of the themes of the collected volume that we're about to publish, because we were concerned about the circulation of books. This is a difficult matter to approach, and we're still, as I said, scratching the surface. But for example, I gave a paper about the presence of Greek books in the Frankfurt Book Fair, which is going to be included in the volume. We have lists of booksellers who were sending books elsewhere and so on. But I mean, the material is still only beginning to be discussed from that point of view. This is one of the approaches. Although we also know that there are specific printing centers that where their production was mostly directed locally, and there are other printing centers whose production was directed internationally. So to return to Raphael's comment earlier, Parisian production was primarily aimed for France, but Lyon production was not aimed for France. So that gives you a very different picture of what's going on, and that's why I'm focusing on the one and not on the other, for example. But we're slowly starting to discuss things like that as well. That's a very good point. Thank you.
All right. Is it on? Yeah. Thank you. That was really interesting, and the project sounds great. You said you're expanding it forward. What about expanding it backwards, bearing the restrictions of 2 years? But I mean, we're in a city that's supposedly founded by a Greek refugee, the name of which, at least by the 1st century AD, they're saying derives from Greek. A lot of what you're discussing, you can really see parallels, even if on a superficial level, to discussions that they're having in antiquity as well. And so what do you think the scope is for taking what you're talking about back? Because what you're saying is more than just book culture. So it's about other forms of heritage and identity. And do you think the authors that you're talking about are aware in antiquity that these very similar discussions are going on about what it means to be Greek and that interest in Greek culture in the past?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very interesting, very nice question. the answer will be a bit disappointing. It's mainly a matter of pragmatics that we have not yet really set up or taken into account the ancient debates about Greek identity and mainly its relation to Roman identity and Latin identity. This would be very interesting indeed, and there are some pointers in the text that I've been studying that suggest that these authors were aware of ancient debates about this. So to that extent, we do take it into account. But the more structural comparison would be quite interesting. But I think before we are there, we really need, at least with the materials that I'm now working with, we first need to explore these texts in detail and see what they have to tell us, also in a comparative, contemporary, let's say, analysis. And then a next step could definitely be to spell out also the differences and similarities, not only with antiquity, but also with the medieval, with the medieval period. Sorry, because that would also be interesting to see if there are significant parallels to draw there. Of course, there the Greek language is not that prominent, to put it mildly, and that makes, I think, the chronological scope that we now have in the project also interesting, because we start, let's say, with the return of the Greek language, if you want to call it a return. It's not an accurate term, but that's what is claimed. The Greek language returns to the Latin West, and we are interested in the impact that narrative has on the way Europeans present themselves and relate themselves to antiquity. In a second analytical step, I think, yes, a comparison with the ancient debates would be interesting and rewarding, especially there where Renaissance or early modern authors seem to dialogue with the ancient sources. Yeah. So thank you for bringing this up. This is
Thank you.
important point.
Hello. Yes. It's quite amusing to see how exactly the same thing 400 years apart can be used for diametrically opposite uses. I mean, in the 16th century, puffing up the national valor of whatever the culture was, and in the 20th century being used by the European Union to erase national differences in the name of a common Greek ancestry. Sorry? Oh, no, what I really wanted to ask is, England seems to have been immune. I mean, in the graph you showed, they only published 2% of the books on Greek culture. Any reason, explanation? Have you looked at it?
So I'll borrow Hans' response and say this is not going to be a very popular answer, but really Britain is a very small printing domain in the 16th century. They produce very few books, even non-Greek books. So it's a very marginal, let's say, printing place. There are some Greek books in Britain, but they're very few. And I think perhaps it picks up a bit more in the 17th century as the British printing or the printing industry in Britain picks up as well. Yes. That doesn't mean there weren't any Greek books in Britain, but they weren't being printed in Britain. They were being imported from the continent, let's say. And I think there is currently a project that started perhaps last year of European books in Britain in the 16th century, something like that. So yes, most of the British scholars had their books from the continent.
Yeah. From the correspondence, did you see the same intellectual effort of trying to appropriate Greece to, English, the language and the culture?
Okay, so I can't talk about the appropriation of the language and the identity, let's say, but there are heated debates about, let's say, the pronunciation of Greek and the role of Greek, which are parallel to the Reformation that is taking place in England. So the way Greek should be pronounced is connected to whether someone wants to reform the church or not. what is now known as the Erasmian accent or pronunciation is connected to reformers and people who were trying to reform the church, and the, let's say, modern Greek pronunciation was connected to people who didn't want to reform the church.
Yes, if I can just add a word to that. So from the sources I've been working with, I've only found very scattered evidence in British sources about connections between, for example, English and Greek, ancient Greek. It seems not to have been that vivid as it was in France, as it was in the Low Countries, as it definitely was in Germany, and even Denmark, and at some point even Finland. So it seems I have not yet found a reason for that, and I should probably delve deeper into it. But what I can say from the sources that we have surveyed now is that in the English world, this is much more less prominent than in other places, markedly less prominent, because there are not these treatises, there are not these word lists, there are not these historical narratives that are spinned about the Greek origins of the nation and that kind of thing. We don't find it in the same way as we find it in other places in Europe, which is interesting in itself, but I can now only register it and not explain it.
One from me. Thank you. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask about the early modern Greeks themselves and the early modern version of Greek that they were speaking. Were they just an inconvenient obstacle to be navigated around, or are they central to these conversations?
Depends on depends on the country, and it depends on the person you ask, probably. Would you ask Poliziano? Yes, he would say that they are an obstacle. Others, like for example Cabacius in Germany, they would be more interested in the let's say early modern Greeks and in their heritage. But that's, I think, a rather underexplored field still. So there's a lot of research to be done, if you ask me.
Do the language treatises discuss the contemporary use of the Greek language in relation to the purity of ancient Greek in early modern French, for example?
Well, I think that these debates for the Greek world, they come much later. Yes, so apart from the let's say Byzantine Greeks in the 15th century, I've seen not much evidence that the Greeks are really participating in these vernacular Greekness debates before the 18th, 19th century. And then it has a completely different ideological and political context, of course. But they seem to be pushed out of the discussion during much of the 16th and 17th century, as far as I've been able to see so far.
I think I've seen some evidence of, particularly in Italy, of a few Greek scholars who, influenced by what is going on in the West, then try to modernize some of the ancient texts. So, for example, we have a modern version of the Iliad, and then we have the pseudo Plutarch on education, which has been rendered in, let's say, modern Greek and then published for Greeks, and some modernized versions of extracts from the Bible, which we suspect are connected to potential for reform in the Greek lands. So there is some echo, but it's in a smaller scale. Yeah.
Printed in Venice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me check the Q&A. No question in the Q&A. Other questions? Yep. Go.
No problem. No, I just wanted to ask if you could say a bit more about this absolutely fascinating glimpse of the use of the language in the Reformation debates, because you touched on it, but it's not something I'd ever considered as a kind of, but so I don't know if you've got a particularly juicy case study to share with us.
You get started.
This is information from secondary literature with regards to Britain, because I haven't done the research myself. I believe Ascom was one of the people who were very much for the original pronunciation of the Greek. In France, that I know more about, oh my goodness, Petrus Ramos was one of the people who wanted the original pronunciation and who was then assassinated during the St. Bartholomew's massacre. So in his grammar, and it's very obvious, when he has the list of letters, he then has the pronunciation next to the letters, and you can see that he's following the original pronunciation, which is in contrast to other grammars that were circulating at the time in France and elsewhere. And that's also interesting with regards to the role of the Greeks in Western Europe, because a lot of these first professors of Greek learned their Greek from Greeks in France. There was at least one person in France who was teaching. So they, and from Italy, from Greeks in Italy. So they continued this sort of tradition, but then it was, let's say, juxtaposed with the ancient pronunciation.
Hmm.
Oh, I think there's a question.
If I can follow up on this, because it's interesting to see that in the use of Greek in the early modern period, indeed, Greek is sometimes used to define religious boundaries, for example, between Catholic and Protestant or reformatory. In the 17th century, for instance, there is a wonderful letter of a Dutch scholar writing to Madrid, throwing in a Greek quote, and then translating it into Latin, although the letter is in French, translating it into Latin, adding, I assume that in Madrid, nobody knows Greek. And this played on this dichotomy between the kind of Protestant North interested in Greek and a Catholic South emphasizing Latin. In the talk that I will be giving on Friday, then we are later than we are in the 17th century, early 18th century. But then in the French context, Greek and knowledge and emphasis on Greek seems to be connected with internal criticisms within the church, with Jansenism in particular. And then the Jesuits attack Jansenist scholars because there would be a new sect of Hellenists. So there you see very clearly how knowledge of Greek, or presumed knowledge of Greek, or assigned knowledge of Greek is drawn into the creation of confessional or religious boundaries. It's quite interesting how a Greek word list could become a kind of marker of religious orientation. It's quite interesting. And it has to do with the move away from Roman Catholic Latinity that is signaled by a display of Greek.
So we have two questions online. I'm not sure we can answer the first one, which may not be very kind. Let's talk about the world. Let's talk from Theo Marinos. Let's talk about the world beyond the small world of scholars. What does the average European of 2024 see things about Greece? More than Summerson, Ouzo, Gyros, Souvlaki? That's an interrogation. If you want to answer this one, it's okay. And another question from Will Stenhouse. Can I ask another question about scope and function? Do you feel that what we will call patristic and Byzantine texts were printed and presented in their paratexts in very different ways from classical ones? And are there differences there between Protestant and Catholic printing centers? You need to come to Rome and discuss.
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Okay, so I wouldn't think that Byzantine and texts and patristic texts are presented in different ways. In fact, I think they're very similar in the way that they approach the texts. So I think that there's similarity there. The next one is if there are differences between Protestant and Catholic centers. Okay, well, yes and no. The truth is that it's very, very nuanced. I'm actually giving a paper tomorrow on Yes, on the activities of the Antwerp Officina Plantiniana and the Leiden Officina Plantiniana, which is sort of the same family in two different domains. The one is the Protestant domain and the other one is a Catholic domain. And there are differences, but there are also similarities. This is one of the big questions that I'm trying to tackle. I think it's going to take a few years to fully tackle this. There are differences. There are some vague differences, but I don't think we can say something definitive now. For example, even the patristic texts, which are claimed by both Catholics and Protestants, they're edited and presented in the same way. The only thing that changes is who the editor is and what kind of preface they put at the front and why they're printing this text. I'm printing this text to show that so-and-so is correct, or I'm printing this text to show that so-and-so is correct. So they're using the same text to present different views. And so I have a very good example of Gregory of Nazianzus being printed both in Antwerp and in Leiden. Different editors, different paratexts. The text assumes a different meaning. So that's part of the answer. It's not a full answer because we don't have a full answer yet. Thank you.
Just one last question, I will say.
Yes. Sorry. Well, besides the sort of political purpose of a lot of those books, or can you see a sort of methodology in the way they work? I mean, is it the beginning of linguistics one way or another?
This is a debated issue. I'm not a historian of linguistics, but I think there would be historians of linguistics who argue that yes, these, let's say, etymological exercises are not only for the sake, have somehow fueled comparative approaches to language and language change and language relationships, even if not according to modern standards and not according to the modern standards of etymology, not at all, because what they do is very humanist. It's the connection between languages is very associative, and the connections between words, the differences between the words are then, let's say, washed away through the permutatio literarum, which is quite a free way of showing connections between words. So some historians of linguistics would say, okay, this fuels or this catalyzes an awareness of different languages and their interrelations and triggers ways of studying them, even if they are not modern ones. And of course, there are historians of linguistics who say, no, the history of linguistics basically starts in the late 18th or early 19th century, mainly with Indo-European linguistics. And that's what the origin of linguistics is. You could perhaps circumvene this somewhat semantic discussion by thinking in terms of thought about language or ideas about language, and then you might be able to see continuities and discontinuities between this early modern and modern tradition. That might be a more fruitful way of looking at it, I personally think. But again, I'm not a historian of linguistics, so I should not transgress my provincia here. Yeah, so different answers, I think, to that question.
But we have lies who work on, sorry. So I've noticed, and I think a couple of other people have also noticed, that people who, meaning early modern scholars who issue Greek grammars or Latin grammars, then go on and issue a vernacular grammar of their own language.
Yes, yeah.
So perhaps the preoccupation with the classical language, with the structures of the classical language, helps them.
Yes, so that's
put the structure.
So that's definitely, let's say that the structures offered by classical grammar help scholars to structure their thought about their own language, and in that sense, you could say there is a connection, let's say more positive connection. Yeah.
Could we?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't want to delay too long, but what you say has interested me because I've recently been involved in an edition of a Latin text by a Scottish Gaelic-speaking author, a Scottish Gaelic-speaking poet, who he's writing about St. Columba, and at one point he's talking about St. Columba visiting the Irish city of Derry, a town which is now within the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. And he says, just completely out of the blue, Derry means the oak grove, and the Greek word druas is similar. And I thought that was an extraordinary thing for anybody to say just completely out of the blue. And I thought, surely he's not, doing comparative linguistics in the middle of the 16th century, but what you say does actually begin to make a certain amount of sense out of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you for this remark. Well, I would be interested in seeing the text you're referring to, but in any case, I hope what I've said shows that this kind of etymologizing thought is not isolated or is not marginal. It is actually quite common in this period in Europe. But I would be very interested to see the text and the reference. Yeah.
So we have one last question in a Q&A box. On the question of different versions of Greek text in Catholic and Protestant translations, have the hardliners on the Protestant side always openly admitted that the Orthodox Church quite naturally speaks of a Holy Catholic Church in the Greek version of the Lord's Prayer?
I'm afraid I don't know how to answer this question because I haven't seen enough text to be able to answer this. So I'll have to have a look.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here in person or online. I want to thank again Natasha and Han. Invite everybody who's here in Rome with us to have a drink just afterwards in the school's entry, and we are waiting the others for the next session of the Rediscovering Byzantium seminar. I never lose my way, so I'm the good opportunity to make some noise about this seminar or any other event that we organize here at the BSR in person or online. Thank you again.